They told you the problem was chips. They were wrong. While Wall Street was obsessing over Nvidia stock prices and GPU shortages, while analysts were building models around semiconductor supply chains, while every headline screamed about H100 waitlists stretching 6 to 12 months, the actual constraint was quietly becoming something else entirely. Something far older, far slower, and far more expensive to fix. And by the time the biggest names in tech finally said it out loud, trillions of dollars were already on the line. Here is what happened. Between 2023 and 2024, the consensus was airtight. Artificial intelligence needed chips. More chips meant more AI. Nvidia controlled roughly 90% of the AI GPU market. Their H100 processors had become the gold standard for training and running large language models, and demand was running 3 times ahead of supply. TSMC, the Taiwanese manufacturer that makes nearly every advanced chip on the planet, was sold out through 2028. Lead times to get an H100 stretched to 6 or 12 months. Hyperscalers, Microsoft, Google, Meta, Amazon were racing each other to lock in procurement. The narrative was simple. Whoever had the most chips would win the AI race. The market believed it. Investors believed it. And for a while, the data seemed to back it up. So what broke the consensus? Not a report, not a research paper. A sentence from Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, one of the most powerful technology companies on Earth. In November of 2025, Nadella said this publicly. The biggest issue now is not a shortage of chips, but power, and the ability to get data centers built fast enough near energy sources. Then he said something that should have stopped everyone cold. He said his company had chips sitting in inventory, physical GPUs, already purchased, already paid for, already delivered, and they could not be turned on. Not because of a software problem, not because of a logistics problem, but because Microsoft did not have the electrical power to run them. Read that again. The most advanced AI hardware in human history was sitting on shelves, idle, because there was not enough electricity to plug it in. Nadella was not alone. In December of 2025, Jensen Huang, the CEO of Nvidia, the man who built the company that manufactures the chips everyone was fighting over, sat down on the Joe Rogan Experience and was asked directly, has energy become the primary obstacle for AI development? He answered without hesitation. He called electrical power availability the bottleneck. The same month, Sam Altman of OpenAI confirmed what Nadella had said. The problem was no longer compute. The problem was power, and this was not a sudden realization. Huang had said it publicly back in March of 2025, months earlier. Every data center of the future will be power limited. The industry knew, but the market had not yet caught up. So how did we get here? Why does running artificial intelligence require so much electricity in the first place? Think about what a modern AI data center actually is. It is not a room full of laptops. It is a facility the size of several city blocks, packed with tens of thousands of high-performance processors running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every single day of the year. Each rack of GPUs generates enormous heat, which requires industrial-scale cooling systems running in parallel. The electricity demand for a single large AI data center can exceed 50 megawatts, enough to power roughly 40,000 American homes simultaneously. And the industry is not building one of these. It is building hundreds. Global data center electricity demand was around 460 terawatt hours in 2022. By 2026, that number is projected to hit 1,000 terawatt hours, more than double in 4 years. By 2030, AI-driven power consumption is expected to grow by 255%. To put that in terms that are easier to feel, the amount of electricity needed just for AI infrastructure by 2030 is roughly equivalent to Japan's entire national power consumption today. The entire country of Japan. For AI alone. That is not a footnote. That is the story. Here's where it gets worse. You might assume that the solution is straightforward. If you need more power, build more power plants. Sign contracts with utilities. Connect to the grid. Done. But the American electrical grid does not work like ordering something online. There is a formal process called grid interconnection, and it is broken in ways that most people outside the energy industry have never been forced to understand. Every new facility that wants to draw significant power from the national grid must go through an approval process managed by grid operators. That process involves engineering studies, capacity assessments, infrastructure upgrades, and regulatory approvals. And right now, the line to complete that process is catastrophic. As of April of 2026, the U.S. interconnection queue, the waiting list of projects trying to connect to the national grid, contains approximately 2,600 gigawatts of capacity waiting to plug in. For context, that is twice the size of the entire installed electrical capacity of the United States today. The median wait time for a new large load customer, which is what a major AI data center qualifies as, is now between 5 and 12 years. 1 decade ago, that same wait was roughly 2 years. California's grid operator reported an average of 9.2 years just to work through the approval line in 2024. Deloitte confirmed that some markets are seeing waits of 7, 9, even 12 years. A data center that breaks ground today in 2026 will likely not receive stable grid power until at least 2030. The construction of the building itself takes between 12 and 18 months. The wait for electricity takes a decade. This is the mismatch that is quietly reshaping the entire AI industry. Hardware scales on Silicon Valley timelines, months, sometimes quarters, but energy infrastructure scales on physics timelines, decades, and no amount of venture capital or shareholder pressure can make a transmission line appear faster. The transformers alone tell the story. A 50 megawatt AI data center requires between 4 and 6 primary transformers. Lead times for those transformers currently run between 52 and 120 weeks just for manufacturing, plus an additional 3 to 6 months for transportation. A piece of equipment that used to be available in months is now a supply chain crisis of its own, before you even get to the grid connection question. So what is the smart money doing while this plays out? They are buying the companies that solve the physical problem, not the chip companies, the power companies. GE Vernova, which supplies the turbines and power generation assets that data centers actually need, has converted this bottleneck into a multi-year order backlog with expanding margins. Vertev, which specializes in thermal cooling and power management for data center infrastructure, signed more than $2 billion in electrification orders in 2025, representing a 3 times increase over the prior year. Their stock rose roughly 170%. Eaton, which manufactures the transformers and switchgear that are now in critically short supply, reported record results in the first quarter of 2026. Quanta Services, a contractor that builds utility infrastructure, is booking work at a pace it has rarely seen. Constellation Energy signed a landmark deal worth more than $2 billion with Microsoft to provide 24/7 nuclear power to its data centers. Utilities as a sector gained 7.5% in the first quarter of 2026. Their best start to a year since 2019. The hyperscalers themselves have made the shift explicit through their own capital allocation. Microsoft committed to nuclear power through the Constellation deal in September of 2024. A public signal that power procurement had become the new priority. Google acquired $4.75 billion in energy infrastructure in 2025 and is exploring what the industry calls co-location, building data centers physically adjacent to power plants to bypass grid delays entirely. Amazon, Meta, and Google have all signed nuclear power agreements. 12 or more gigawatts of nuclear capacity have been committed to AI data centers as of May of 2026. ExxonMobil is planning to build co-located natural gas plants specifically to serve AI infrastructure. Tesla Energy deployed 46.7 gigawatt hours of battery storage in 2025 and is ramping a 50 gigawatt hour factory in Houston. The reason all of this is happening is simple. If you have your own power source, you do not wait in the interconnection queue. You build on your own timeline. The financial scale of what is required is almost impossible to process in one sitting. McKinsey estimates total data center capital expenditure through 2030 could reach between $5.2 trillion and $7.9 trillion. Goldman Sachs puts cumulative AI capital expenditure between 2026 and 2031 at approximately $7.6 trillion. Grid spending specifically needs to reach at least $720 billion just to support the load. JP Morgan estimates the United States alone will need $1 trillion in grid investment over the next decade, and globally $5.8 trillion. Nearly half of all U.S. data centers planned for 2026 are already facing delays or outright cancellations. Not because the chips are unavailable, not because the software is not ready, but because the power is not there. Here's the question worth sitting with. If the constraint is no longer chips, if the constraint is now a physical grid that takes a decade to upgrade, transform transformers that take 2 years to manufacture, transmission lines that require regulatory approval, and construction on timelines measured in presidential terms. What does that mean for the pace of AI development? The industry spent years solving the chip problem. Enormous capital, engineering talent, and geopolitical effort went into securing semiconductor supply. And it worked. The chips are there, but now the chips are sitting in boxes waiting for electricity, and electricity is not a technology problem. It is a civil engineering problem, a regulatory problem, a physics problem, and those problems do not respond to the same tools that solved the chip shortage. Which brings us to the only honest conclusion this data permits. The artificial intelligence industry is not just a software story or a semiconductor story. It is an infrastructure story. An infrastructure, real infrastructure. The kind that moves electricity across hundreds of miles and keeps it stable enough to run servers without interruption. That infrastructure was built over a century. It cannot be rebuilt in a decade simply because someone needs it faster. The constraint that will actually determine how quickly AI scales over the next 10 years is not sitting in a TSMC fab in Taiwan. It is sitting in the interconnection queue of a regional grid operator in the American Midwest. It is sitting in the order backlog of a transformer manufacturer in Ohio. It is sitting in the office of a state utility commission reviewing an application that was filed 3 years ago. The market spent years looking at the wrong thing, and by the time the CEOs started saying it plainly, the chips are here. The power is not. The infrastructure deficit was already measured in trillions and decades. So here is what we want to know from you. Do you think the American grid can actually be upgraded fast enough to support the AI build-out that technology companies are betting trillions on? Or are we heading toward a version of this story where the hardware is ready and the electricity simply never arrives? Drop your honest read in the comments, because the people building these facilities are making that bet right now with real money, and not everyone is going to be right. The gap between what the industry promises and what the physical world can actually deliver is where the most interesting stories live. If you want to keep seeing those gaps exposed before they become obvious to everyone else, subscribe and stay close. The next one is already in the pipeline.